Ancient Egypt presented itself as a land of balance, law, and divine order, yet hidden behind palace walls existed a world far more controlled than the public ever saw. The royal harem was a secluded institution where wives, daughters, concubines, and foreign women lived under the constant watch of guards, attendants, and officials. Life inside appeared calm with gardens, painted rooms, and strict routines, but every step was monitored and every word could become a report. These women were considered part of the pharaoh's household, bound to serve his interests, and their loyalty was treated as a matter of state security. For a harem woman to attempt escape was viewed not as a personal act of desperation, but as a threat to the stability of the throne. Punishments were severe, often hidden from public knowledge, and carried out in chambers that outsiders never entered. This documentary examines the secret world of the harem and the terrifying consequences that awaited any woman who tried to break free, revealing the darker measures Egypt used to maintain control over those kept closest to its rulers. The harem of ancient Egypt was designed to appear peaceful, but its foundations were built upon restriction. Every woman who entered those walls understood that her world had changed forever. The long avenues leading to the palace were lined with guards, and the limestone corridors beyond them created a maze meant to confuse anyone who did not belong. The harem was not simply a residence. It was a system of control created to protect the pharaoh's lineage and political stability. Within those boundaries lived women who came from noble houses, conquered lands, and diplomatic alliances. Each carried her own history, yet once inside, she was reshaped by the rules of the palace. The first layer of restriction involved physical separation. The complex was arranged so that entrances were guarded, windows were elevated, and outdoor areas were enclosed with high walls. Even balconies looked inward toward courtyards rather than outward toward the city. This design ensured that no woman could see the world beyond or communicate with anyone outside the palace. Movement inside the harem required permission from overseers who recorded the purpose of every walk, visit, and request. These officials were chosen for their loyalty to the pharaoh and were trained to recognize signs of unrest or potential escape. Inside the harem, the women lived in structured groups. Senior wives occupied the more spacious quarters, while foreign concubines were often kept in smaller rooms near the outer halls. Daily routines included beauty treatments, lessons in etiquette, religious rituals, and household crafts. It was a quiet life on the surface, yet it carried an unspoken pressure. A woman who failed to follow expectations could face punishment, not for disobedience alone, but for endangering the honor of the royal household. Every action was intertwined with the reputation of the pharaoh, and a single misstep could shift her position from favored companion to potential traitor. Attempts to escape emerged from this atmosphere of isolation. Some women longed for the families they had left behind. Others could not accept a life where their futures were decided by rankings and politics. There were women brought from foreign kingdoms who struggled with the language and customs of Egypt, feeling more like captives than participants in royal life. In rare cases, ambition itself became the motive. A woman who thought she deserved more influence might seek escape if she felt she had no path to rise within the harem's hierarchy. Yet regardless of the motive, the consequences were always severe. This chapter explores more than the architectural boundaries. It examines the psychological walls that shape the daily existence of harem women. The palace ruled through surveillance, subtle intimidation, and an intricate web of informants. Servants who delivered food or helped with clothing were expected to report any suspicious conversations. Physicians who examined the women documented not only their health, but their behavior. Tutors observed attitudes during lessons, noting signs of resistance or sadness. Even religious rituals were monitored by priests who understood that spiritual unrest could reflect deeper dissatisfaction. Escape was nearly impossible because the palace was designed to crush the idea before it could form. Women were reminded constantly that their lives were tied to the pharaoh's power, and the threat of punishment was woven into every story told within the walls. Tales of past attempts were repeated in hushed tones, with young girls warned that even thinking of escape was dangerous. The harem officials ensured that each woman understood her place and they reinforced these lessons through ceremonies, rules, and daily reminders that the outside world no longer belonged to them. Yet despite all these measures, thoughts of freedom still surfaced. A woman might watch from a courtyard as the sky changed colors each evening and wonder what the city streets looked like beyond the palace. She might hear distant sounds from marketplaces during festivals and remember a life where she walked among crowds without permission. She might long for the voice of a sister, a mother, or a childhood friend. It was within these quiet moments that the desire to escape grew. And once the desire existed, the palace considered it a threat that had to be controlled swiftly. The walls that defined the harem were both real and symbolic. They held beauty and danger in equal measure. Women lived surrounded by luxury, yet every object reminded them of the boundaries they could not cross. They slept on carved beds that rested beneath painted ceilings, showing scenes of loyalty and divine order. They walked across floors decorated with motifs of protection and obedience. They bathed in pools, meant to purify not only their bodies, but their devotion to the pharaoh. Everything served as a quiet reminder that freedom was no longer theirs to claim. This chapter prepares the ground for what follows. To understand the punishments for escape, one must first understand the world that made escape unthinkable. The walls of the harem did more than confine. They shaped identity, erased former lives, and trained women to accept silence. Yet somewhere among those shadows were voices that refused to be contained. Those voices drove women to take risks that the palace considered unforgivable. And when they did, the full force of Egyptian royal justice descended with a brutality that was rarely spoken of outside those guarded gates. The palace that housed the royal harem was not a single building, but a sprawling network of halls, courtyards, chambers, and guarded passages. Each section had its own purpose, its own supervisors, and its own rules. For a harem woman, even imagining the entire layout was dangerous, because knowledge of the palace's structure was considered a security threat. The officials who managed the harem ensured that no woman understood the full map. She knew only the spaces she was allowed to enter and the paths she took each day. Everything beyond those limits existed in rumor, fragments, and the whispers of servants who had seen more than they were permitted to describe. The restricted nature of the palace created an environment where curiosity became both a coping mechanism and a silent rebellion. Women who felt trapped often spent hours studying the movement of guards or the timing of gates that opened briefly for deliveries. They learned which hallways echoed footsteps and which allowed sound to disappear. They noticed the different uniforms of soldiers and the way scribes carried tablets when they entered the administrative wings. They watched the shadows cast by the palace towers at different hours, trying to understand how time shaped the architecture around them. All of this was information that might offer a path to freedom, yet gathering it was a risk in itself. The palace guards understood that escape attempts began long before a woman reached a gate. They began with observation, with accidental questions, with curiosity that exceeded what the officials deemed acceptable. This was why casual conversations were monitored. A woman who asked about travel routes or the duties of soldiers could be reported to the overseer. A servant who noticed a pattern of wandering or lingering near restricted corridors was expected to say something. The palace did not rely on punishments alone to enforce control. It relied on fear, the knowledge that every action could be interpreted as a threat. In such an environment, even innocent behavior could be treated as evidence of disloyalty. The forbidden pathways formed a world within a world. There were corridors reserved for officials who managed the treasury, others for scribes who handled royal decrees, and others still that housed the sacred domains of priests. These areas were protected by layers of guards who were trained to question anyone they did not recognize immediately. A harem woman walking toward such corridors without authorization could be stopped, questioned, or detained. The officials did not need proof of wrongdoing. Suspicion alone was enough to justify intervention. Many women learned quickly that avoiding certain hallways was necessary for survival. Beyond the administrative wings lay the palace gates, which were the most heavily protected areas in the entire complex. These gates opened only for official processions, religious ceremonies, or large deliveries overseen by trusted supervisors. Even then, guards checked every cart, every servant, and every item leaving the palace. The idea that a single woman could slip past such scrutiny was nearly impossible. Yet attempts were still made, often in moments of desperation rather than careful planning. A woman might see a gate open during a festival and feel a sudden urge to run, forgetting the consequences that awaited her. Such impulsive attempts rarely made it beyond a few steps before guards intervened. Other forbidden pathways were more subtle. Some involved doors that led to storage rooms, kitchens, or workshops. These spaces connected indirectly to outer areas of the palace and were therefore considered risky. Overseers often rotated access to these rooms so that no woman or servant could learn their patterns. Even the servants who worked there were assigned schedules that changed frequently. The palace understood that knowledge was power, and it guarded that knowledge fiercely. Women who tried to memorize these routes often found themselves moved to other sections of the harem as a preventative measure. There were also myths about secret tunnels beneath the palace. Some women believed they had been built during earlier dynasties to allow royalty to escape during invasions. Even if such tunnels existed, they were sealed long before the New Kingdom. The stories persisted because they offered hope, and hope was dangerous. A woman who believed in the possibility of a hidden exit might act upon it, and the palace viewed such beliefs as a threat. Priests who oversaw rituals in the harem would gently discourage such ideas, reminding the women that escape was impossible and that loyalty to the pharaoh was the only path to stability. Despite all these measures, the forbidden pathways represented something more symbolic than physical. They were reminders of the world that existed just beyond reach. A woman might hear distant market sounds through a courtyard wall, or smell spices carried by a passing servant who had traveled through outer halls. She might see guards returning from the city, dust on their sandals, sunlight on their armor. These small details reminded her that life continued beyond the palace, even if she could not reach it. And these reminders, while faint, were enough to fuel thoughts of escape. The palace existed in layers, each designed to limit freedom while maintaining an appearance of order. The harem was a jewel at the center of these layers, guarded not only by soldiers, but by the invisible boundaries of fear and uncertainty. A woman considering escape had to navigate more than physical corridors. She had to navigate a system of rules that punished curiosity, punished movement, and punished hope. Those who attempted to defy these boundaries faced consequences severe enough to silence anyone who watched. Yet the human desire for freedom could not be entirely extinguished, even by the palace's most elaborate designs. As we move deeper into this story, the forbidden pathways become more than setting. They become symbols of the choices the women faced. Each corridor represented a risk, each gate a reminder of what waited beyond, each shadow a whisper of possibility. And when the palace considered escape an unthinkable act, the decision to try was itself an act of resistance. The punishments that followed were crafted to ensure that such resistance would never spread. Life inside the harem was shaped not only by walls and gates, but by the people whose duty was to watch, report, and maintain absolute order. These individuals were never meant to be noticed. They moved quietly, observed carefully, and carried authority without raising their voices. Their presence formed an invisible net around every woman in the harem, ensuring that no action went unseen, and no attempt at freedom could unfold without consequence. These watchers were the true guardians of the palace's secrecy, and countless escape attempts ended long before they ever reached a gate because of them. Among the most trusted were the eunuchs, individuals chosen specifically because they were considered loyal to the pharaoh and incapable of forming relationships with the women they supervised. Eunuchs supervised nearly every aspect of daily life, from escorts to lessons to private rituals. They kept records of attendance, behavior, and health, and submitted reports to officials who managed the household. Some eunuchs were strict and formal, while others offered small kindnesses, but none could afford to ignore their duties. A careless overseer could face severe punishment for allowing even the slightest deviation from the established rules. Servants formed another layer of observation. They carried water, prepared cosmetics, and arranged clothing. Yet their role extended far beyond these tasks. They listened to conversations, noted changes in mood, and observed when a woman seemed withdrawn or unusually restless. Servants who provided information were rewarded with better food, improved sleeping spaces, or reduced working hours. This encouraged them to speak freely about what they saw. Even a comment spoken in passing could be turned into a report, creating an atmosphere where trust between women became fragile and uncertain. A friend could become an informant without warning. Priests also played a role within this network. They conducted purification rituals and instructed the women in worship, but part of their responsibility involved ensuring spiritual obedience. A woman who prayed for freedom or cried during ceremonies could draw attention. Priests would report emotional instability to the overseers, who viewed such behavior as a potential sign of resistance. Even the spiritual life of the harem was tied to surveillance. Rituals that were meant to soothe the mind became occasions where the palace evaluated loyalty. Scribes, though rarely seen by the women, held a powerful influence over their fates. They maintained records detailing each woman's origin, status, behavior, and suitability for different roles in the harem. If a woman asked too many questions about the palace or appeared to be forming unusual relationships, the scribes would note this, and the information could affect her future treatment. A simple entry on a tablet might determine whether she received additional privileges or whether she was monitored more closely. In the palace, writing was not merely documentation, it was control. The guards were the most visible watchers. Armed and disciplined, they stood at entrances and along corridors, positioned strategically to observe movement patterns. They were trained to notice hesitation, quickened steps, or attempts to avoid certain areas. A woman passing a guarded post was required to present herself with calm composure. Any sign of fear could be interpreted as guilt. Guards were taught to react quickly and decisively, and many escape attempts ended when a woman was stopped long before she reached an exterior gate. Guards did not need proof to detain someone. Suspicion alone was enough to justify restraint. Even the physicians contributed to this system. Their examinations of the women went beyond health. They documented stress, sleep patterns, and emotional strain. A woman who appeared troubled or fatigued might be questioned by overseers, especially if such behavior suggested she was planning something. Physicians sometimes noticed injuries that hinted at attempts to climb walls or move through restricted spaces. Any mark that could not be easily explained was reported, even if it resulted from an accident. The palace preferred overreaction to oversight. All these groups, eunuchs, servants, priests, scribes, guards, and physicians, worked together to create an environment where privacy did not exist. Every woman understood that she was never alone. Even in her chamber, she might feel the weight of unseen eyes. Heavy curtains and decorated screens could not conceal the sense that someone was always nearby, listening or watching. This constant surveillance affected the way women behaved. They spoke softly, avoided unnecessary questions, and limited their movements to prevent drawing unwanted attention. The watchers also shaped relationships within the harem. Women learned quickly that confiding in the wrong person could lead to punishment. Gossip spread not only among the women but through the servants, who passed stories upward to the overseers. Friendships were carefully chosen and often hidden. A woman might trust someone with a small secret only to discover that the information had been reported. In such an environment, loyalty and betrayal were constantly at war, and isolation became a method of self-preservation. Escape attempts were rare, partly because most women did not know whom they could trust. Planning required secrecy, yet secrecy was almost impossible. A whisper could travel through several layers of servants before reaching an official. An unusual request could be interpreted as preparation for escape. Even silence could be suspicious if it suggested deep thought or emotional turmoil. Many women learned to suppress their desires, fearing that their internal struggles would be discovered before they had the chance to act. The silent watchers did more than maintain order. They removed hope. They ensured that every woman understood her place, not through violence but through the knowledge that nothing could be hidden. The system was designed so that fear was constant yet invisible. Punishments did not need to be frequent. The threat of being caught, the knowledge that someone was always observing, kept the harem stable. As this documentary continues, we explore not only the punishments themselves, but the machinery that made such punishments effective. The Watchers were the first barrier between a woman and freedom, and for many, they were the last. Rebellion inside the harem did not begin with dramatic gestures or loud declarations. It began quietly, often almost invisibly, in the smallest corners of a woman's daily life. A shift in her posture during a ritual, a moment of hesitation before obeying an order, a lingering glance toward a guarded corridor, or even silence where conversation was expected could mark the earliest signs of resistance. For the officials who monitored the harem, these subtle changes were warnings. They signaled the possibility of unrest long before a woman made any attempt to escape. Understanding these signs was essential to maintaining palace security, and the harem staff were trained to notice them with remarkable precision. The first sign often appeared as emotional withdrawal. A woman who had once participated fully in lessons, rituals, and daily routines might begin to move more slowly or speak less frequently. She might eat less at meals, spend more time alone in her chamber, or avoid the communal gardens where the women gathered. At first, such changes were easy to dismiss as fatigue or illness. But in the palace, behavior was never interpreted at face value. A withdrawn woman might be grieving her former life, longing for her family, or quietly plotting an escape. Her emotional distance raised questions about her loyalty and stability. Another early sign of rebellion came through curiosity. A woman who began asking about schedules, guard rotations, or the duties of servants risked drawing attention. Even innocent questions could be misinterpreted as attempts to gather information for escape. Women quickly learned that curiosity was dangerous. Those who did not restrain it were noticed by servants, who repeated their questions to overseers. A simple inquiry about how often the palace gates opened could become a mark of suspicion in the records maintained by scribes. Knowledge was restricted for a reason, and any effort to expand one's understanding of the palace could be taken as preparation for defiance. Restlessness was another sign officials watched for. A woman might begin walking longer routes within the harem, taking advantage of the few spaces where she was permitted to wander. She might stand near doors or windows for longer than usual, watching guards or listening to sounds from outside. Restlessness was not uncommon among new arrivals, especially those who came from foreign kingdoms and struggled with homesickness. But when restlessness persisted, it suggested that a woman's dissatisfaction was becoming stronger than her fear. Such women were often reassigned to different quarters to break any patterns they had begun forming. Sometimes the first signs of rebellion emerged physically. A woman might develop small injuries that hinted at attempts to climb balconies or reach high windows. Scraped palms, bruised arms, or torn fabric could indicate that she had explored places she was not meant to reach. These incidents were taken seriously. Physicians were required to report injuries that did not align with daily routines. If a woman's explanation seemed unlikely, officials investigated further. The palace understood that escape was rarely spontaneous. It grew from experiments, attempts to test boundaries, and efforts to understand the limits of the harem's structure. Rebellion could also manifest in relationships. A woman might begin avoiding certain companions or become closer to others who shared her frustrations. Group dissatisfaction was particularly dangerous. 2 or 3 women whispering together could create unrest capable of spreading through the harem. Eunuchs and servants monitored social interactions carefully. If a woman appeared to be influencing others, she was watched even more closely. The palace feared not only individual escape attempts but collective resistance. A united group of women could challenge the order of the harem in ways far more difficult to control. The most subtle sign of rebellion was hope itself. Hope could be recognized in a woman's eyes, in the way she looked at the horizon through a courtyard opening, or in her delayed obedience to commands. Hope changed posture, voice, and expression. It created questions in the mind of the watchers. A woman who still believed in the possibility of freedom was unpredictable. The palace preferred women who had surrendered to their circumstances. Those who still dreamed of escape were considered dangerous even if they said nothing. The officials handling these early signs followed a strict protocol. First, they increased surveillance on the suspected woman. Servants were instructed to watch her closely and report any unusual behavior. Next, the woman's movements were restricted. She might lose access to certain rooms or be reassigned to quarters farther from the palace gates. She could be placed under the supervision of senior wives, who were known for their obedience and influence. These steps were designed to break her resolve before it grew stronger. If the signs persisted, the palace initiated psychological measures. The woman might receive warnings disguised as advice. A eunuch might remind her of past attempts that ended in severe punishment. A priest might speak to her about duty, loyalty, and divine expectations. These conversations were not confrontational. They were meant to instill fear and shame, weakening any desire to act. The palace knew that preventing rebellion was easier than stopping an escape once it began. In some cases, the early signs were misinterpreted. A woman suffering from grief or illness could be mistakenly treated as a threat. Such errors revealed the fragility of life inside the harem. Even emotions viewed as natural in other circumstances became dangerous within the palace. Women learned to hide their pain, suppress their questions, and disguise their longing. The harem demanded obedience not only in action but in thought. The first signs of rebellion mattered because they revealed the human side of life behind the palace walls. Women who showed resistance, however small, reminded the palace that no amount of surveillance could fully crush the desire for freedom. Their struggles carried the weight of longing, frustration, and courage. These early warnings were the beginning of stories that often ended tragically. And for the palace, recognizing these signs was essential to preventing any breach in the carefully constructed world of the harem. The discovery of an escape attempt was rarely sudden. More often, it unfolded slowly through small observations gathered by the people who maintained order within the harem. Every moment leading to discovery was shaped by tension, fear, and the palace's relentless commitment to control. By the time officials acted, the signs had usually multiplied, creating a picture too clear to ignore. Yet for the woman involved, the moment of discovery arrived with shocking force, ending her hope and exposing her to consequences she could never outrun. The process often began with a fragment of information. A servant might mention that a woman had been unusually quiet. A eunuch might report that she hesitated during a ritual. A priest might remark that her prayers carried a note of distress. Individually, these details seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Overseers listened closely for such patterns, recognizing that rebellion rarely announced itself directly. They used these small observations to determine whether a woman's behavior posed a risk to the stability of the harem. Once suspicions were strong enough, officials began investigating quietly. They did not confront the woman immediately. Instead, they watched her more closely, noted the time she left her chamber, paid attention to where she walked, and recorded with whom she spoke. They instructed servants to observe her habits and report anything unusual. This stage of investigation often lasted days, sometimes weeks. The palace preferred certainty before taking action, and certainty required patience. During this time, the woman might sense that something had changed. She might notice additional guards near her corridor, or feel the presence of eyes lingering longer than before. In some cases, discovery occurred through physical evidence. A servant might find a scrap of torn fabric caught on a balcony edge. A eunuch might notice footprints on a restricted stairwell. A guard might hear noises near a gate at an unusual hour. Even the smallest detail drew attention, because it suggested an attempt to test the boundaries of the harem. Physical evidence carried more weight than suspicion alone, and once found, it set the investigation into motion. Sometimes discovery came through human weakness. Fear could drive a woman to confide in a friend, and that friend might betray her in exchange for favor or safety. The harem created an environment where loyalty was fragile, and secrets were burdens few women dared to carry. Even whispered plans could reach the ears of servants, who were trained to report anything that deviated from routine. A woman who spoke her fears too openly risked drawing the notice of people who valued their positions more than trust. The moment of discovery took many forms. One of the most feared was the surprise inspection. Overseers might arrive unannounced at a woman's chamber, demanding to search her belongings. They looked for hidden garments, makeshift tools, or written notes that hinted at escape. They inspected windows, examined beds, and questioned anyone who had interacted with the woman recently. Inspections were conducted with calm authority, yet their impact was devastating. A woman facing such scrutiny understood that her life had reached a turning point. Another form of discovery was the silent summons. A eunuch might appear at the door of a woman's chamber and inform her that she was needed in the administrative hall. These summonses were quiet, without explanation, giving no room for refusal. The walk to the hall felt long and heavy. Each step carried the weight of uncertainty. When a woman entered the chamber where overseers waited, she understood that the palace had uncovered part of her story. Whether she admitted anything or not, the officials already believed they had found enough reason to question her. The harshest moment of discovery occurred when guards physically intercepted an escape attempt. These moments unfolded quickly and without warning. A woman might try to slip behind a servant carrying supplies, climb a low wall, or approach a gate when it opened for a procession. Guards reacted instantly. They restrained her, sometimes by force, and escorted her away from the public areas. Such attempts were witnessed by few, but the echoes of struggle carried through the palace. Women who heard them understood the danger of defiance. Regardless of how discovery took place, the aftermath followed a predictable path. The woman was removed from her usual quarters and placed under tighter supervision. She might be isolated in a guarded room, prevented from speaking to others. Officials questioned her about her intentions, her relationships, and her reasons for attempting escape. They looked for accomplices, real or imagined. The palace operated under the assumption that rebellion could spread, so officials sought to eliminate any possibility of a wider conspiracy. During questioning, a woman faced a choice. She could deny everything, hoping the palace lacked sufficient evidence, or she could confess in hopes of receiving a lesser punishment. Neither path guaranteed safety. The palace valued order above all else, and any attempt to violate that order was treated with severity. Even a partial confession could lead to punishment, and silence was often interpreted as guilt. The woman's fate depended less on her words and more on the palace's assessment of her potential threat. The moment of discovery was not merely an interruption. It was a turning point that transformed hope into fear and possibility into loss. The palace wanted women to remember this moment, not to forget it. Discovery was intended to be unforgettable, a lesson for the woman and a warning for all who observed her fate. Within the harem, stories of discovery spread quickly, shaping the thoughts and actions of others. They reminded everyone that escape was not only difficult but dangerous, in ways that extended far beyond a single act. In this chapter, we see how the palace's system of control reached its peak at the moment of discovery. It combined observation, surveillance, and swift action to ensure that rebellion could not take root. The discovery marked the beginning of consequences that would shape the rest of a woman's life, if she survived them at all. The capture of a harem woman attempting to escape was a moment shaped by urgency, fear, and absolute authority. Unlike the slow buildup of suspicion or the quiet investigations that preceded it, the act of capture unfolded suddenly. One moment might hold the fragile hope of freedom, and the next would collapse beneath the weight of the palace guard's unquestionable power. In the strict world of ancient Egypt's harem, capture was not just the end of an attempt. It was the beginning of punishment, humiliation, and the total loss of control over one's fate. Capture usually occurred within the palace walls, long before a woman reached the main gates. The harem was designed to prevent even the slightest chance of escape, and guards were placed strategically along all possible routes. These guards were trained to recognize unusual movements, sudden silence, or changes in posture. They reacted instantly, often without allowing the woman time to speak or explain. A guard who failed to act could face consequences as severe as those facing the escapee, so their loyalty to protocol outweighed any sympathy they might feel. The moment of capture often began with sound, a hurried footstep, a soft thud, or the rustle of clothing against stone-alerted guards. Women attempting to flee sometimes tried to move silently, but fear made their steps quick and unsteady. Guards patrolling narrow corridors were accustomed to the rhythms of palace life. Any sound that broke those rhythms stood out immediately. When a guard turned a corner and saw a woman moving toward a restricted area, he acted with swift authority. Sometimes capture was the result of a coordinated response. If reports reached overseers that a woman had slipped away from her designated area, guards throughout the palace were alerted. They sealed exits, positioned themselves at intersections, and moved through the harem in groups. A woman caught in such a sweep found herself surrounded before she had traveled far. These coordinated responses revealed the palace's commitment to control. Escape was seen not as a personal act, but as a threat to the pharaoh's reputation and household stability. The response reflected the seriousness of that threat. In some cases, capture occurred at a moment when a woman felt closest to freedom. She might reach a courtyard where an outer door stood open for a delivery. She might approach the shadowed edge of a storage passage that led toward the administrative wings. She might even catch a glimpse of sunlight or hear the distant noise of city streets. These moments hardened her resolve, but they also heightened the vigilance of the guards. A woman running toward an exit would be seized firmly, often dragged back into the palace before she understood what had happened. The physical act of capture varied. Some guards restrained a woman by grasping her arms, while others used staffs or leather straps to prevent resistance. A woman who fought back faced harsher restraint. Her cries were muffled by the stone walls, echoing through halls that had heard such sounds before. Guarded passageways swallowed the noise, allowing only fragments to reach the ears of women in the harem. Those who heard them tightened their grips on their shawls, understanding that another attempt had failed, and that punishment would soon follow. After being seized, the woman was often brought to a central hall used for questioning or immediate evaluation. Her appearance told a story: disheveled clothing, dirt on her hands, bruises on her arms from climbing or resisting. Guards presented her to overseers with a formal report describing where she was found and what action she had taken. The woman stood before officials who understood their role as protectors of palace secrecy. Their expressions rarely showed emotion. They had seen escape attempts before, and each one reinforced their purpose. At this stage, the woman was not yet punished. She was assessed. Officials examined her condition, questioned her briefly, and determined whether she posed a danger to the stability of the harem. They asked whether she acted alone, whether she had spoken to others, and whether any servants had assisted her. These questions were not intended to uncover truth alone. They were also meant to break her spirit. A woman who felt overwhelmed might reveal more than she intended. A woman who remained silent risked harsher punishment because silence was interpreted as defiance. Once the initial questioning ended, the woman was escorted to a secure chamber where she awaited judgment. These chambers were small, dimly lit, and isolated from the rest of the harem. Guards stood outside at all hours. A woman placed in such confinement felt the weight of the palace in its most direct form. The walls no longer offered beauty or symbolism. They became instruments of control. The silence of the chamber pressed heavily on her, reminding her that she had no power left. For many women, the capture marked the moment when hope disappeared. The adrenaline that fueled their attempt faded quickly, replaced by fear, regret, and uncertainty. Some cried softly, others sat silently, and some whispered prayers for mercy. The palace expected all of these reactions. Emotional collapse was natural, and in the eyes of officials, necessary. A woman who fully understood her situation was easier to control during the punishment phase. Capture also served as a message to the entire harem. Rumors spread quickly despite the palace's efforts to maintain silence. Servants whispered about the woman who had tried to flee, describing her capture in fragments that grew and shifted with each retelling. These stories reinforced obedience among the others. Women learned that escape attempts ended not with freedom, but with humiliation and suffering. Capture became a deterrent more powerful than punishment itself. In this chapter, we see how the palace approached escape not as an accident, but as an attack on its authority. The capture of a harem woman was designed to be swift, decisive, and deeply frightening. It removed hope, isolated the escapee, and reminded everyone that the palace's control was absolute. Yet the story of capture was only the beginning. What followed was far more terrifying. The punishments that awaited a woman after capture revealed the true power the palace held over her life. The interrogation chamber was one of the most feared places within the palace complex. Few women ever entered it, and none wished to return. It was not a large hall filled with instruments of torture, nor a dramatic courtroom where accusations echoed through open space. Instead, it was a small room with thick walls, sealed windows, and an atmosphere shaped entirely by control. The chamber was designed to strip away certainty, dignity, and strength. A woman brought there understood immediately that the palace no longer viewed her as a resident of the harem. She was now a threat whose motives had to be uncovered with precision. The room itself revealed the purpose behind its creation. A single oil lamp provided light, casting shadows that made the walls seem closer than they were. A low wooden chair sat at the center, facing a plain table where officials placed their tablets and writing tools. The air felt cool and unmoving, heavy enough to settle on the skin. The silence was deliberate. Every sound made by the woman or the officials seemed amplified, heightening her anxiety. The atmosphere alone was enough to break some women before the questioning even began. The officials who conducted the interrogation were chosen for their composure. They spoke slowly and calmly, their voices steady even when delivering accusations. Their goal was not to shout or intimidate through noise. It was to create an environment where the woman's thoughts collided with fear and uncertainty. They asked questions designed to provoke emotional responses. They observed her posture, her breathing, and her hesitations. Every detail became part of their evaluation. Whether she confessed or resisted, her fate depended on how the officials interpreted her reactions. The interrogation began with simple questions. The officials asked why she had left her quarters, whether she had spoken to others about her attempt, and whether she understood the seriousness of her actions. These questions seemed harmless at first, but they were calculated. Each answer shaped the direction of the next question. A woman who admitted confusion or fear was treated differently from one who attempted to justify her actions. The officials used every word she spoke as a tool, turning her own explanations into evidence of rebellion. As the questioning continued, the tone grew heavier. Officials asked whether she had accomplices, whether any servants assisted her, and whether she had received messages or promises from outside the palace. These questions reflected the palace's deepest fear, that a single act of defiance could spread into a larger conspiracy. The harem was filled with women whose families had political ties, whose marriages were part of alliances, and whose presence reflected delicate diplomatic balances. An escape attempt threatened these foundations. The interrogation sought to uncover not only personal motives, but potential political implications. Silence was treated as suspicion. A woman who refused to answer or hesitated too long risked being labeled defiant. Officials interpreted every pause as resistance. They allowed silence to stretch, letting anxiety fill the room. The woman felt pressure to speak even when she had nothing to confess. When she answered too quickly, they questioned her sincerity. When she answered too slowly, they questioned her honesty. There was no safe path through the interrogation. Each response carried risk. Occasionally, the officials confronted the woman with false claims. They might insist that a servant had already confessed to helping her, or that another woman had implicated her in a plan. These statements were designed to test her reactions. A change in her expression or breath could be interpreted as confirmation. The woman often did not know whether the officials were telling the truth. This uncertainty further weakened her ability to defend herself. The interrogation chamber turned doubt into a weapon. Not all women resisted. Some broke quickly, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. They confessed to actions they had not taken, hoping to appease the officials. Others tried to explain their reasons calmly. They spoke of loneliness, sorrow, or desperation. Yet the palace rarely viewed emotional suffering as justification. Instead, officials interpreted such explanations as instability, which could be considered just as dangerous as defiance. The palace preferred obedience without question, not emotional complexity. A few women attempted to maintain dignity. They sat upright, chose their words carefully, and held their composure even as the officials challenged their accounts. These women displayed strength the palace did not welcome. A harem woman who remained calm under interrogation was seen as capable of deeper rebellion. Her confidence implied that she still held a sense of self beyond the palace walls. and such identity was considered a threat. Strong women were punished not simply for the attempt to flee, but for the inner strength that made escape thinkable. The interrogation did not rely on physical violence. It relied on psychological pressure. The officials' words carried weight, and their authority created an environment where the woman's fear shaped her own downfall. She often left the chamber drained, trembling, and unsure of what she had said. The officials remained composed throughout, documenting her responses and consulting among themselves. Their notes determined the severity of the punishment that would follow. Once the interrogation ended, the woman was escorted back to isolation. She was not told her fate immediately. The palace understood that uncertainty was its own form of punishment. Hours or days might pass before officials reached a decision. During this time, the woman confronted her fear alone. She replayed the interrogation in her mind, questioning every word she had spoken. The silence of her chamber became a deeper torment than the interrogation itself. The interrogation chamber represented the palace's mastery of control. It revealed how power could be exerted without force, how fear could be created without shouting, and how a woman's own mind could become a battlefield the palace did not need to enter physically. For those who passed through its doors, the memory lingered long after the questioning ended. It marked the transition from rebellion to punishment, from hope to despair. What followed in the next chapters would show how the palace used its authority to ensure that no woman ever dared to test its limits again. Punishment in the harem did not always involve physical suffering. Sometimes the most lasting wounds were inflicted through humiliation. The palace understood that dignity held great power in the lives of harem women. Their identities were built on their beauty, status, behavior, and their ability to maintain honor within a world shaped by strict expectation. When a woman attempted to escape, the palace sought not only to punish her body, but to break the dignity that had defined her place in the harem. Public shame, carried out within private walls, became one of the most effective ways to accomplish this. Despite being hidden from the outside world, the harem was a community with its own social order. Women competed quietly for the pharaoh's attention, respect from overseers, and influence over rituals and daily routines. Within this enclosed society, reputation mattered deeply. A woman who lost face among her peers experienced a kind of isolation that the palace used deliberately. They knew that shame spread quickly and reshaped how the escapee was viewed by others. Punishments of public shame were conducted in controlled spaces such as central courtyards, training halls, or ritual chambers. These areas were large enough for groups to gather, yet removed from the palace wings where officials worked. The event was not open to the entire palace, but it was witnessed by enough women to ensure that the message was clear. Some punishments were attended by senior wives only. Others included younger concubines and servants who needed to understand the consequences of breaking palace rules. The captured woman was brought into the assembled group by guards or eunuchs. Her appearance often reflected the struggle of her capture. Her hair might be disheveled, her garments torn or replaced with plain linen. The purpose was not simply to make her look vulnerable, but to contrast the dignity she once held with the state she now embodied. A woman dressed in fine clothing commanded respect. A woman reduced to simplicity before her peers signaled the loss of status the palace wanted to emphasize. During the punishment, officials read aloud the charges against her. They spoke clearly and without emotion, listing the rules she had broken and the dangers her actions posed to the stability of the harem. Their words echoed through the chamber, forcing the woman and all who watched to confront the seriousness of her attempt. The accusation itself became a tool of control. Hearing her name linked to disobedience marked her permanently in the memory of others. Some punishments required the woman to kneel or stand at the center while those around her observed in silence. The stillness of the group made her shame more intense. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the judgments forming behind lowered eyes, the tension that came from witnessing a moment none wished to experience themselves. Silence was not compassion. It was compliance. Each witness accepted the palace's authority by participating, even passively, in the ceremony. Other punishments involved symbolic gestures meant to degrade the woman's former status. Her hair might be cut to indicate the loss of her beauty. A sash or ornament once worn with pride might be removed publicly. In some cases, officials required her to recite words of apology to the pharaoh, acknowledging that her attempt to escape was an offense not only to the household, but to divine order itself. These gestures demonstrated her fall from acceptance to disgrace. Shame extended beyond the ceremony. After the punishment, the woman's lodging might be moved to a less desirable area. She might lose privileges such as access to gardens, bathing chambers, or educational lessons. The other women, even those who once sympathized with her, often avoided speaking to her. Association with someone marked as disobedient could draw unwanted attention. The palace relied on this social isolation to reinforce the punishment. The escapee felt the consequences not only through official action, but through the shifting behavior of those around her. Servants played a significant role in spreading the story. Their whispered accounts moved quickly from one corner of the harem to another. They described the woman's appearance, the official's tone, and the reactions of the witnesses. Each retelling grew slightly, emphasizing the severity of the punishment. These stories reached women who had not witnessed the event firsthand, ensuring that the message extended throughout the harem. Shame became a warning that traveled farther than the ceremony itself. The purpose of public shame was not to destroy the woman completely, but to prevent others from following her example. In some cases, the palace allowed the punished woman to reintegrate into the harem after a time. Her life would be more restricted, her status reduced, but she remained alive. This allowed the palace to maintain a balance. Severe punishments were reserved for repeat offenders or those whose escape attempts carried political implications. Public shame served as a middle measure, harsh enough to deter others, but not extreme enough to disrupt the internal order. The psychological effects of public shame were long-lasting. A woman who once held confidence now moved quietly, avoiding attention. She questioned her worth, wondered whether the people who watched her punishment judged her fairly or cruelly. Some women retreated emotionally, becoming shadows of their former selves. Others internalized the punishment, blaming themselves for the humiliation. Few ever recovered fully. Shame reshaped identity, and the palace understood this with intentional precision. Public shame within private walls was one of the palace's most calculated tools. It revealed the dual nature of the harem, a place filled with beauty, ritual, and privilege, yet governed by strict control and harsh consequences. The harem functioned smoothly because the women understood not only the rules, but the cost of breaking them. Shame was a reminder visible to all, a quiet punishment that lingered long after the ceremony ended. What waited beyond shame, however, was far darker. The palace held punishments designed not only to humiliate, but to harm. And the next chapters will reveal how far ancient Egypt was willing to go to ensure obedience. Among the punishments used inside the harem, few were spoken of with more fear than the whipping post. It was not used for minor offenses, nor for simple disobedience. It was reserved for women whose actions challenged the authority of the palace, and an escape attempt was considered one of the gravest violations. The whipping post represented a level of physical punishment that left both immediate pain and lasting marks. Its purpose was not only to discipline the woman, but to send a message through the harem that no one could ignore. The whipping post itself was a simple structure, often made from carved wood, anchored firmly into the ground. It stood in a private courtyard used only for internal punishments. Few women ever saw it directly, yet many heard whispers about what happened there. Some servants claimed that it had existed for generations, replaced only when time weakened its frame. Its simplicity was intentional. The palace did not rely on elaborate devices. It relied on the certainty that the punishment would be carried out swiftly, without hesitation. When a woman was sentenced to be whipped, the announcement was delivered in calm, formal language. Officials did not raise their voices or show anger. They spoke with the detached authority of people carrying out state duty. The woman was informed of the number of lashes she would receive, though this number depended on the severity of her actions and the judgment of the overseers. A woman who acted alone out of desperation received fewer lashes than one suspected of conspiring with others. Repeated attempts brought harsher punishment. The palace weighed not only the offense, but the potential threat she posed to order. Before the punishment, the woman was escorted to a holding chamber near the courtyard. Her hands were bound lightly, not to restrain her completely, but to prevent sudden resistance. Guards stood close, not speaking unless necessary. The air in the holding chamber felt heavy, filled with the tension of what was about to happen. A woman in this space often cried quietly, whispered prayers, or fell into silence as fear overwhelmed her. The palace allowed these emotions. They revealed that the punishment had already achieved part of its purpose. When the moment arrived, the woman was brought into the courtyard. The space was enclosed by high walls, ensuring that the punishment remained private. Only a small group witnessed the event, the officials delivering the sentence, the guards enforcing it, and sometimes a handful of senior wives, whose presence was meant to reinforce the seriousness of the offense. The whipping post stood in the center, casting a narrow shadow across the stone floor. The woman's fear deepened when she saw it, even if she had prepared herself mentally. No one could face the post without feeling its weight. The woman was positioned with her hands secured to the post, her back exposed. The guards ensured she stood firmly, though they did not speak unless instructed. The official overseeing the punishment read the charges once more, repeating her attempt to escape and emphasizing the threat it posed. These words served two purposes. They justified the punishment and reminded the woman why she suffered. The palace understood that pain alone did not break a person. Pain connected to shame and guilt created deeper submission. The lashes were delivered with measured precision. The guards chosen for the task were trained not to act with anger, but with controlled force. Each strike was swift, producing a sharp sound that echoed against the stone walls. The woman's cries varied. Some screamed, others sobbed, and some made no sound at all, their breath caught in their throats. The palace did not require a specific reaction. They required endurance. The punishment ended only when the appointed number of lashes was completed. The aftermath was often worse than the punishment itself. The woman's back burned with pain, and the marks left by the whip varied from shallow welts to deep cuts depending on the intensity. In severe cases, physicians stood nearby, ready to stop the punishment if the woman lost consciousness. Their presence was not driven by compassion. It was driven by responsibility. The palace wanted punishment, not death. A dead woman could not serve as a reminder. A surviving one, bearing the marks of defiance, became a living warning. Once the punishment ended, the woman was released from the post and allowed to collapse or be supported by guards. She was escorted back to a treatment chamber where physicians cleaned the wounds and applied oil or herbal remedies. These treatments were meant to prevent infection and ensure she healed enough to resume daily routines. Painkillers were given sparingly. The palace wanted the wounds to heal, but not too quickly. The marks needed to remain long enough to reinforce the lesson. After her recovery, the woman returned to her quarters. Her movements were slower, her posture stiff, and her demeanor subdued. Other women saw the change, even if they pretended not to. They noticed the careful way she sat, the way she avoided lifting her arms, and the quiet manner in which she moved through the harem. Word spread quickly about her punishment. Servants carried the story through whispers, describing the number of lashes and the condition in which she returned. These stories reached every corner of the harem, and the fear they created was as powerful as the punishment itself. The whipping post remained a symbol of the palace's willingness to use pain as a tool of control. It reminded women that the harem was a place of privilege only when its rules were followed. The beauty of the surroundings, the rituals of daily life, and the comforts provided by palace servants did not erase the truth that disobedience carried consequences carved into the skin. The palace did not rely on violence often, but when it did, it left marks that lasted far beyond the physical wounds. This chapter reveals how punishment within the harem balanced secrecy with severity. The whipping post was hidden from public eyes, yet its impact shaped the thoughts and fears of every woman inside. It was a clear message. Escape was not only forbidden, it was dangerous in ways that touched both body and spirit. Among all the punishments imposed on harem women, isolation was considered one of the most psychologically devastating. It did not break the body as violently as whipping, or as publicly as humiliation, yet it weakened the spirit in ways few could endure. The isolation cell was designed to silence thought, distort time, and reduce even the strongest woman into quiet submission. It was not simply a place to confine someone. It was a place to erase the inner world that made escape imaginable. The isolation cell was a small chamber hidden deep within the palace's restricted corridors. Few knew its exact location. Servants who delivered food did so under guard, and the eunuchs responsible for keeping the keys were sworn to secrecy. The cell's walls were made of thick stone that absorbed sound, allowing nothing to escape. Light entered only through a narrow slit near the ceiling, too high for a woman to reach and too small to reveal anything beyond the faintest suggestion of day or night. The room smelled of cool dust and aged limestone, carrying a stillness that felt heavy and unchanging. When a woman was sentenced to isolation, the guards escorted her quietly and without ceremony. Her hands were bound, not out of necessity, but to emphasize her lack of control. She walked through unfamiliar corridors, the path intentionally confusing. The palace wanted her to lose any sense of direction or distance. When the door finally opened, she stepped into a space colder and darker than anything she had experienced inside the harem. The door closed behind her with a soft but definitive sound, sealing her inside. Isolation altered time. The woman inside could not track the sun, did not know when guards approached, and could not distinguish morning from night. Meals arrived through a small opening in the door, delivered silently. No one spoke to her. No one answered her attempts to communicate. If she cried out, her voice returned to her in faint echoes that vanished quickly. Days blended, hours repeated, and the mind searched for structure where none existed. The palace understood that silence could shape obedience more effectively than pain. The psychological effects appeared gradually. Some women paced the cell endlessly, counting each step to maintain a sense of order. Others sat in the corner, holding their knees to their chest for warmth. The cell's coldness seeped into the body, making rest difficult. Sleep arrived in fragments, interrupted by fear and the constant awareness of being alone. Without conversation or connection, thoughts grew louder. Regret intensified. Memories sharpened. The woman replayed the events that led her to this place, analyzing every decision and imagining alternative outcomes that could never be changed. For women who had attempted escape in moments of desperation rather than defiance, isolation felt especially cruel. Their longing for freedom had been driven by emotion, not rebellion. Now that same emotion turned inward, becoming guilt or panic. They questioned their own choices and their worth. They wondered whether anyone in the harem cared about their fate or whether their disappearance had gone unnoticed. The silence pressed against these thoughts, amplifying them until they became overwhelming. Some women turned to prayer. They whispered pleas to the gods of Egypt, invoking Hathor, Isis, or any deity who might hear them through the thick walls. They prayed for mercy, forgiveness, or rescue. The act of prayer gave them structure, a way to measure time. Yet even prayers felt uncertain inside the isolation cell. Without the presence of priests or ritual offerings, prayer became an act of survival rather than worship. It was a fragile thread connecting them to the world beyond the chamber. Not all women endured isolation in the same way. Some resisted mentally, forcing themselves to remain calm. They breathed deeply, counted quietly, repeated old songs or stories in their heads. They tried to anchor themselves to memory, recalling the faces of their families or the landscapes of their homelands. These women often survived isolation with their spirits intact, though their bodies weakened from the strain. But even the strongest woman felt moments when the darkness seemed to swallow everything she believed she controlled. The palace never kept women in isolation indefinitely. The confinement typically lasted days or weeks, depending on the offense. The purpose was not to end a woman's life, but to correct her behavior. When officials believed she had reached the point of submission, guards opened the cell and escorted her out. The light of the hallway stung her eyes, forcing her to squint. Her legs often trembled from lack of movement. The transition back to the ordered world of the harem felt overwhelming. Sounds seemed too sharp, voices too loud, and movement too sudden. Upon returning to the harem, the woman usually carried visible signs of her confinement. Her hair might be tangled, her steps slow, her voice faint. The other women noticed these changes immediately, even if they pretended not to stare. Servants whispered about how long she had been gone, guessing at the details of her punishment. The woman herself rarely spoke about the isolation cell. Even when asked gently, she kept her memories buried. The palace counted on this silence. Stories about the cell were not meant to spread through details. They spread through fear. Isolation served a purpose beyond punishment. It reminded every woman in the harem that her world depended entirely on obedience. The palace could take not only freedom but connection, comfort, and human presence. It could reduce her existence to a dark room where time held no meaning. The cell became a place where hope dissolved into stillness, where identity blurred into fear, and where rebellion died quietly without witness. The absence of violence did not make isolation merciful. Its cruelty lay in what it removed: light, sound, companionship, and the sense of being human within a larger world. For many women, the memory of isolation shaped their behavior long after the punishment ended. They moved more carefully, spoke more softly, and obeyed without hesitation. The palace achieved through silence what it could not always achieve through force. Branding and marking were among the harshest punishments reserved for harem women who attempted escape, especially when their actions were deemed threatening to royal authority. While physical pain was involved, the deeper purpose of these punishments was symbolic. Branding created a permanent reminder of disobedience, a visible mark that transformed a woman's identity forever. Within the palace, where beauty, refinement, and status shaped every aspect of life, such a mark destroyed a woman's place in the harem and reshaped how everyone viewed her. It was not only punishment, it was erasure. Branding was not used casually. It was invoked only when the palace believed a woman posed a long-term threat, or when officials wished to send a powerful warning to the entire harem. A woman who attempted escape more than once, who conspired with others, or whose actions risked humiliating the pharaoh, could face this punishment. By marking her body, the palace ensured that she could never hide her defiance. Even if she remained within the harem for years afterward, the mark declared her history to anyone who saw it. The ceremonies of branding were conducted in private, away from the gardens and living quarters. The palace chose a secluded chamber where few would witness the act itself, yet many would learn of it through whispered descriptions. Guards escorted the woman there after interrogation. Her hands were bound, not out of necessity, but to enforce the idea that she no longer controlled any part of her fate. She walked slowly, each step heavy with dread. Even women, who had endured whipping, feared the branding chamber more deeply. Inside, the room contained only what was necessary. A brazier glowed with charcoal. Its smoke rose in a thin, wavering column, filling the air with a sharp metallic scent. A metal rod or small patterned stamp rested nearby, heating until it reached a temperature capable of burning the skin instantly. The sound of metal shifting within the brazier echoed faintly, creating a tension that settled into the woman's chest. There were no elaborate instruments. The simplicity made the punishment more terrifying. Officials stood nearby, overseeing the procedure with formal detachment. Their expressions remained composed as they read the woman's offenses. They reminded her of the rules she had broken, and the consequences her actions carried not only for herself, but for the entire harem. These words were ritualistic, meant to strip away her final sense of autonomy. The woman was then positioned in a kneeling posture. Guards held her steady, ensuring she could not move when the moment arrived. Branding targeted areas of the body that could be concealed beneath clothing, yet remained significant enough to hold meaning. Common locations included the upper shoulder, the back near the shoulder blade, or the side of the rib cage. These areas allowed the mark to remain covered in daily life, yet visible to officials or physicians during routine examinations. In some eras, a simple line or symbol was used. In others, a small hieroglyph representing disobedience or danger served as the mark. The specific design varied depending on palace customs. When the metal finally touched her skin, the pain was immediate and overwhelming. It seared through the flesh with a heat so intense that the woman's cry echoed through the chamber even if she tried to suppress it. Some fainted from the shock, others trembled uncontrollably. The guards held her steady, ensuring the mark remained precise. The officials did not prolong the act. The branding itself lasted only seconds, but those seconds etched themselves permanently into memory. Afterward, physicians stepped forward to treat the wound. They applied ointments to prevent infection and wrapped the area carefully. Their treatment was not an act of compassion. It was an act of preservation. The palace wanted the mark to heal clearly and remain visible. A scar blurred by infection defeated its purpose. The woman was then taken to a recovery chamber where she rested under guard. Her movements were monitored closely, as branding weakened both body and spirit. The psychological impact of branding often surpassed the physical pain. The woman understood that she now carried a permanent sign of defiance, a mark that set her apart from others. Her interactions changed immediately. Servants treated her with caution. Other women avoided meeting her eyes. Even those who had once been friendly kept their distance, fearing association with someone who had been marked. The woman's own self-perception shifted. She no longer moved with the same confidence or ease. She carried her mark as both a burden and a warning. The palace relied on this transformation. Branding was intended not only to punish the woman who received it, but to alter the atmosphere of the harem itself. Whispers about the punishment spread quickly. Servants described the woman's cry, the smell of burning skin, and the precise moment the metal touched her flesh. Younger concubines recoiled in fear. Senior wives shook their heads and spoke quietly of duty. Even those who believed themselves loyal felt a tremor of dread. The palace had shown what it was willing to do to maintain order. Some women branded for escape never attempted rebellion again. They lived quietly, resigned to their fate, avoiding attention and following every instruction with careful obedience. Others grew bitter, carrying their pain inward, speaking little and trusting no one. A few held onto fragments of defiance but hid them beneath layers of caution, knowing they would not survive a second attempt. The mark shaped every path differently, yet all paths reflected the palace's power. Branding was a punishment that outlasted all others. Whipping left scars that could fade with time. Isolation ended eventually. Public shame lingered in memory but not on the skin. Branding, however, remained for life. It recorded a woman's history in a language the palace controlled. It turned her body into a document the officials could read. It was a reminder that the harem allowed no space for rebellion, not even in the privacy of one's thoughts. This chapter reveals how deeply the palace understood the nature of control. Pain alone was not enough. The palace aimed to reshape identity, redefine worth, and create a visible symbol of obedience enforced. Branding ensured that a woman who tried to flee would never forget the price of her attempt, and neither would anyone who saw her scars. Among the many punishments designed to control the harem, few were as layered in symbolism as the rituals of cleansing and forced redemption. These rites were not gentle spiritual practices meant to heal. They were corrective ceremonies created to strip a woman of her former identity, purify her in the eyes of the palace, and redefine her as someone who belonged wholly to the pharaoh's household. On the surface, the rituals appeared religious. In truth, they were psychological tools meant to reshape the mind of any woman who dared consider escape. These rituals began with removal from ordinary life. After a woman completed her isolation, whipping, or exile, officials often decided she required purification before rejoining any part of the harem. The reasoning was always framed as spiritual necessity. Her attempt to escape, they claimed, had disrupted the harmony of the palace and offended the divine order. To restore balance, she needed to undergo cleansing. But the true intent was clear. The palace used ritual as a mask, allowing punishment to wear the appearance of sacred correction. The woman was escorted at dawn to a secluded chamber, used only for ceremonial purposes. The room was dim, illuminated by a few oil lamps that flickered against painted walls. Images of deities covered the space, showing goddesses of purity and gods of judgment. Hathor, Mut, Ma'at, and other divine figures seemed to watch her as she entered. The symbolism was deliberate. These images served as silent witnesses, reminding the woman that her actions had been judged by more than human authority. Before the ritual began, attendants removed her clothing and replaced it with a plain white linen garment. This garment represented purity, yet it also emphasized vulnerability. Her hair was unbound, falling freely over her shoulders. She stood barefoot on the cold stone floor, feeling every texture beneath her feet. Priests and eunuchs surrounded her quietly, forming a circle that prevented escape and commanded absolute focus. No words of comfort were offered. No expression of kindness appeared. The ritual demanded emotional exposure. The first stage involved water purification. A basin of cold water mixed with herbs was poured slowly over her head and shoulders. The water dripped down her back, sending shivers through her body. The priest chanted in controlled tones, reciting verses that described the cleansing of impurities. In older rituals, this stage symbolized renewal. In the harem's corrective ceremonies, it symbolized surrender. The woman closed her eyes and endured the cold, knowing that resistance would only prolong the ritual. After the water cleansing came the examination. Priests inspected her hands, feet, and face, speaking softly about purity of action and speech. They touched her forehead with a mixture of oils and ground minerals, marking her temporarily as someone whose thoughts needed realignment. The oil's scent lingered on her skin, reminding her of the ritual long after it ended. This stage was meant to break psychological resistance. By forcing the woman to stand still while being examined, the palace reinforced the idea that her body and mind belonged not to herself, but to the institution she had attempted to flee. The third stage focused on recitation. The woman was required to repeat phrases declaring loyalty to the pharaoh, the harem, and the divine order. These statements were simple, but heavy with meaning. She spoke them slowly, her voice trembling. If she faltered, priests corrected her insistently. The recitations served as both confession and reconstruction. Each word reshaped her identity into something more aligned with the palace's expectations. The woman's voice echoed through the chamber, yet she felt as though she were losing a piece of herself with each phrase. In some cases, the ritual included symbolic offerings. The woman was asked to place flowers, grains, or small objects before the images of the gods. These offerings represented her willingness to submit. She bowed her head and placed each item carefully, aware that every action was being observed. The gesture appeared gentle, but the implication was clear. The palace used ritual to demand humility. A woman who once walked confidently now knelt before symbols chosen specifically to remind her of her place. The final stage involved enforced silence. After the recitations and offerings, the woman was required to sit alone in the chamber for a period of time determined by the priests. The door remained open just enough for guards to observe her, but no one spoke to her. She sat quietly, breathing the cold air, her thoughts clouded by exhaustion and ritual pressure. This silence was meant to settle the ritual's impact deeply into her mind. It allowed the fear, shame, and confusion to merge into submission. When the ritual ended, attendants dressed her again, though her garments were simpler than before. She returned to the harem with her body cleansed, but her spirit unsettled. Other women recognized the signs immediately. They noticed the faint scent of ritual oil, the tired posture, the distant look in her eyes. They whispered quietly about the cleansing, sharing fragments of stories they had heard from others. These whispers amplified the ritual's power. Even those who had never experienced it feared its effect. For many women, the ritual became a turning point. Some emerged more submissive, their desire for escape extinguished. Others felt humiliated, but learned to hide their resistance more carefully. A few were traumatized by the experience, struggling with the memory of standing exposed under the watch of priests and officials. The ritual did not break everyone, but it shaped all who endured it. Ritual cleansing and forced redemption revealed the palace's ability to use belief as a tool. Pain could weaken the body, but ritual altered the mind. By framing obedience as purity and rebellion as impurity, the palace ensured that punishment carried spiritual weight. A woman who underwent the ritual was not only corrected, she was symbolically reborn into obedience, leaving behind the part of herself that once sought freedom. In a world defined by hierarchy and identity, few punishments were more terrifying than being erased from the palace records. To outside observers, the harem appeared carefully organized, with every woman accounted for by name, origin, rank, and role. These records were not simple lists. They were the foundation of each woman's existence. They determined her privileges, her duties, her daily routines, and even her future within the royal household. To be removed from the records was to become a ghost inside the palace, someone who existed physically but not officially. It was a punishment that stripped a woman of her very place in the world. The process began quietly, often days after the woman completed her physical or ritual punishments. While she recovered, scribes met privately with overseers to review her case. They discussed whether her offense had caused enough disruption to warrant erasure. This punishment was reserved for women whose escape attempts were considered deeply threatening, those who caused unrest among others, or those whose families outside the palace posed potential political risks. Once the decision was made, the scribes prepared new tablets to replace the old. The official removal took place in a room rarely entered by anyone outside the administrative ranks. Here, rows of clay tablets lined the walls and shelves. Each one held the life stories of women who lived and served within the harem. Names, origins, dates of arrival, duties, and evaluations were carved carefully into the clay. A woman's entire identity was contained in these lines, proof that she belonged to the royal household. To erase her from these records was to remove her from the order that defined Egyptian palace life. The scribe first located her tablet. He carried it to a central table where an overseer supervised the act. The scribe set the tablet down, picked up a flat-edged tool, and began smoothing out the carved lines. Each stroke removed a part of her identity. Her name disappeared first, then her lineage, then her position. The clay dust gathered silently in small piles, slipping off the table and falling to the floor like fragments of a life being undone. The room was quiet, except for the steady scraping of the tool, a sound that signaled the palace's power to define existence itself. When the surface was fully smooth, the tablet no longer carried her story. It was either rewritten for another purpose or set aside for future use. The palace kept no trace of her former identity. In the eyes of the palace, she no longer existed as a harem woman. Her place in ceremonies, lessons, or rituals was erased. Her name was never spoken again in official contexts. To newcomers, she appeared to be just another servant or laborer. To officials, she was someone who had forfeited the right to be remembered. Meanwhile, the woman herself was informed of her erasure not through ceremony, but through silence. She returned to the harem, expecting to resume a modified routine. Instead, she found her name missing from rosters, her chamber assigned to another, her scheduled duties reassigned without explanation. When she approached attendants for guidance, they responded with phrases carefully crafted to avoid specific acknowledgement. They told her she must wait for instructions. They told her she was not listed among the morning assignments. They told her nothing more. A quiet shift occurred around her. Women who once shared meals or lessons with her now avoided her gaze, uncertain whether speaking to her could endanger their own positions. Servants regarded her with a mixture of pity and caution. Eunuchs spoke to her only when necessary, using the shortest instructions. She still existed in the palace, yet she moved through it as though she were invisible. The palace had turned her into a living reminder of its power to decide who mattered and who did not. The psychological impact of removal from the records was deep. A woman, who once walked with purpose, now felt lost in every hallway. Without assigned duties, she drifted through tasks given arbitrarily by guards or servants. She no longer belonged to any group. She could not participate in rituals, attend lessons, or claim privileges. Her identity as a harem woman, something she had been trained to uphold from the moment she arrived, was gone. She had become a shadow within the palace walls. For some, this loss of identity broke their spirit more effectively than physical punishment. Women who suffered this fate often withdrew emotionally, their voices growing quiet, their presence fading into the background of palace life. They carried themselves with uncertainty, unsure where they were allowed to stand, sit, or speak. When they slept, it was in the servants' quarters, where no one asked about their past. When they worked, it was at the edge of every room, doing the tasks assigned to those without rank. Yet the palace did not remove women from the records out of cruelty alone. The act served a larger purpose. It warned others that status within the harem was not permanent. It reminded them that privilege was a fragile thing. maintained only through obedience. The palace wanted women to understand that their value was tied entirely to their compliance. If they broke that bond, their history could be erased with the stroke of a scribe's tool. Some women continued living quietly within the palace for years afterward. They aged without acknowledgement, their presence known only to a small circle of servants. Others were eventually sent away to work in temple households or care for elderly officials, still nameless, still erased. Their stories became cautionary tales whispered among new arrivals. Over time, even those whispers faded, leaving the erased women truly forgotten. In the silent world of the harem, where identity shaped every moment, removal from the records was among the most devastating consequences a woman could face. It turned her into a person who existed without lineage, rank, or recognition. It severed her connection to the palace's memory. It made her invisible in a place where visibility defined survival. And for the palace, that invisibility was the clearest warning it could give. Execution was the rarest and most extreme punishment a harem woman could face. The palace used it sparingly, not out of mercy but out of calculated necessity. A woman's death risked drawing attention, spreading fear beyond control, or creating unrest among the harem's residents. Yet when the palace believed a woman's actions threatened the pharaoh, the royal line, or the stability of political alliances, execution was carried out swiftly and quietly. It was framed as an act of honor, a final protection of the kingdom's purity and order. A woman sentenced to death had usually crossed boundaries far beyond escape. She might have attempted to leave the palace with sensitive information, conspired with an external faction, or endangered a royal child's security. In the most severe cases, she might have attempted escape during a politically tense moment when her actions could be interpreted as treason. The palace did not tolerate anything that risked dishonoring the pharaoh. Execution was used not only to remove the threat, but to restore symbolic balance. The process began in absolute secrecy. The woman was not informed immediately. Officials conferred quietly in administrative halls, reviewing testimonies, examining evidence, and consulting with priests who interpreted signs and omens. The final decision came from the highest-ranking overseer of the harem, often in coordination with palace administrators. Once the sentence was approved, the woman was summoned under the pretense of further questioning. She followed obediently, unaware of the fate awaiting her. The execution chamber was hidden deep within the palace complex. Unlike the whipping courtyard or isolation cells, it had no ceremonial beauty or symbolic decoration. It was a stark, silent place where only necessary individuals were allowed to enter. A single oil lamp illuminated the room, casting shadows across the stone floor. The air was cold and unmoving. The walls contained no inscriptions, no gods, no signs of ritual approval. This setting emphasized that execution was not a religious act, but a political one. The method of execution varied depending on the era and the severity of the crime. Strangulation was the most common. It was quiet, left no blood, and avoided the spectacle of violence. A heavy linen cloth or rope was used, tightened quickly by trained guards. Death came within moments. Poison was another method, administered in a drink or paste. It caused the woman to lose consciousness gradually. Both methods ensured silence, preserving the secrecy of the act. Rarely, when the offense was believed to involve supernatural danger or spiritual betrayal, priests participated. In such cases, they used ritual phrases to condemn the woman's actions before execution. The ceremony was not elaborate. It focused only on severing her connection to the royal household. But these instances were exceptional, reserved for women believed to have committed acts that threatened the moral fabric of palace life. Before the execution, the woman was bound lightly at the wrists, more for control than restraint. Her eyes often widened when she realized the truth, yet few resisted physically. Some cried out in shock or begged for mercy. Others collapsed in resignation. A few maintained quiet dignity, understanding that resistance would change nothing. The palace did not punish emotional responses. It simply carried out the act with calm, practiced efficiency. After the woman's death, her body was prepared immediately. Servants washed her, wrapped her in plain linen, and removed any jewelry or ornaments she once possessed. She was no longer part of the royal household. She was no longer recognized in the records. Her body was taken through hidden passages to avoid detection. Burials varied. Some women received simple interments in unmarked ground near palace walls. Others were taken to distant temple lands, buried anonymously without ceremony. The goal was always the same: to erase her presence and memory. News of the execution did not spread openly. The palace never announced these deaths. Yet whispers eventually circulated among the harem. Servants who noticed a missing face, eunuchs who overheard hurried footsteps, or older women who recognized patterns of silence pieced together the truth. These fragmented stories created an atmosphere of dread. Women spoke in hushed tones, warning each other never to cross certain boundaries. The palace allowed these whispers because fear ensured obedience. For those who lived in the harem, the threat of execution became a distant but powerful presence. It was not a punishment they expected to face personally, yet its possibility shaped their thoughts. They moved more carefully, avoided confrontation, and silenced desires that might lead to disobedience. Execution did not need to occur frequently to be effective. The mere knowledge that it existed changed the behavior of everyone within the harem walls. The palace justified execution by framing it as an act of honor. Officials insisted that the death protected the pharaoh's name, preserved the lineage, and maintained cosmic balance. In their view, a woman who betrayed the harem betrayed the entire kingdom. Priests supported this narrative, speaking of purity, order, and the necessity of sacrifice. Whether the woman believed these words or not no longer mattered. Her story ended the moment the sentence was carried out. What remained afterward was silence. A chamber returned to darkness. A tablet removed from the shelves. A memory erased from the official narrative. Yet the echo of execution lingered in the minds of those who stayed behind. It reminded them that even within the palace's most private walls, life could be taken quietly and without witness. It revealed that the harem, despite its beauty and luxury, was shaped by rules so strict that defiance could cost everything. This chapter exposes the final and most extreme measure used to ensure obedience. Execution was not frequent, but it was absolute. It represented the palace's full authority, the power to define life, identity, and memory. And for the women who remained, the fear of this outcome shaped every moment of their existence. Long after individual punishments ended, the fear they created lingered throughout the harem like a quiet shadow. It shaped conversations, routines, relationships, and even the way women breathed within the palace walls. Every story of an escape attempt, every whisper about isolation, branding, exile, or execution became part of a collective memory that governed the lives of generations of harem women. This legacy of fear was not accidental. It was a deliberate system crafted to ensure that order remained unbroken, that loyalty stayed unquestioned, and that no woman dared repeat the mistakes of those who attempted to flee. The harem was built on layers of silence. Women spoke in lowered voices, choosing words carefully and avoiding subjects that might draw attention. Even casual discussions were shaped by the knowledge that servants, eunuchs, or attendants might overhear. Younger women learned early that certain questions should never be asked. They were taught to accept boundaries without explanation, to suppress curiosity, and to interpret silence as instruction. Fear settled into these lessons not through force alone, but through repetition. A whispered warning from an older concubine held more weight than an official decree. Stories about the punishments circulated in fragments. A woman returning from isolation moved differently, her steps cautious, her eyes avoiding contact. Those who saw her understood without needing details. A servant who witnessed part of a whipping described only the sound. That sound alone became enough to shape nightmares for women who had never approached the courtyard. Rumors about branding grew in vividness with each retelling. Some claimed the metal left marks that glowed faintly in the lamplight. Others believed women branded for escape felt phantom heat in the scar during ritual ceremonies. No one knew the full truth, but the uncertainty strengthened the fear. Even punishments that did not leave visible scars held long-term influence. Public shame transformed the social structure within the harem. Women who witnessed such punishments carried the memory with them for years. They recalled the way the punished woman stood before the group, the way officials spoke her name, and the way the air felt heavy with quiet judgment. These memories became warnings passed from one generation to the next. Younger women grew up understanding that disgrace was not only a personal fall, but a permanent shift in how others treated them. The servants' quarters also held stories. Exiled women sometimes worked silently alongside those who had never seen the harem's inner chambers. Their presence served as a reminder that privilege could vanish overnight. New concubines entered the palace with bright hopes, seeing beauty and opportunity. Yet they also heard the soft murmurs about women who once held favor and now slept on reed mats, performing tasks under the watchful eyes of senior servants. These whispers did more than frighten. They taught obedience through the painful example of others. The possibility of being erased from the records haunted many women more than physical punishment. Identity was everything in the harem. To lose one's place meant losing purpose, protection, and recognition. Women who had once enjoyed education and ritual lessons could vanish overnight, their names smoothed away by a scribe's tool. Younger harem women watched for signs of such disappearances. They noticed when a familiar face stopped appearing during morning routines, or when a chamber door remained closed for too long. These quiet absences created an atmosphere where fear filled every unexplained silence. Even execution, though rare, shaped life through its secrecy. No ceremony marked the event. No tomb bore the woman's name. Yet the signs appeared in subtle ways. A chamber reassigned abruptly, a sudden increase in guarded passages, servants who avoided certain halls with unspoken tension. Women who noticed these changes did not ask questions. They understood that someone had crossed a boundary that could not be forgiven. This awareness tightened the rules women imposed on themselves, making the harem orderly not through constant punishment, but through constant caution. Generations later, even when specific stories faded, the atmosphere created by these punishments remained. The harem became a place where obedience was instinctive, where fear was inherited like tradition, and where freedom existed only in thoughts that women learned to silence. Rituals continued, beauty routines persisted, and lessons shaped daily life. Yet beneath the surface ran an undercurrent of tension. Women carried themselves with careful precision, understanding that they lived in a world where a single mistake could alter their fate completely. The palace, for its part, viewed this environment as success. The legacy of fear ensured stability, reduced rebellion, and preserved the image of a harmonious royal household. Officials believed that order was maintained not only by walls, guards, and overseers, but by the psychological weight of stories repeated quietly through generations. The punishments themselves mattered less than the fear they became. This fear defined the harem as much as its luxurious chambers or intricate rituals. Despite this, some women held on to inner strength. They learned to navigate the rules without losing the core of who they were. They kept memories of their birth families, stories from their homelands, and small private expressions of identity alive within themselves. These quiet acts of resilience did not challenge the palace directly, but they allowed women to maintain fragments of individuality in a world designed to erase it. Their resilience became a hidden legacy alongside the legacy of fear. In the end, the punishments used against harem women who attempted escape revealed more than the harshness of palace rule. They exposed the fragile nature of freedom within a system built on beauty, hierarchy, and control. They taught women to survive, not through strength alone, but through caution, silence, and understanding the limits of their world. And although the harem appeared peaceful on the surface, every woman who lived within its walls carried the memory of those who dared to run. The legacy of fear ensured that attempts to escape became rare. It shaped the harem across eras, leaving an invisible imprint on every generation that followed. It remained long after the women themselves were gone, woven into the architecture, rituals, and whispered stories of a world that allowed privilege only under strict obedience. In this final chapter, we see how punishment did more than correct behavior. It crafted an enduring atmosphere that defined life behind the palace walls.